The parchment burned cold in Cordelia Prescott's hands, which made no sense at all because parchment did not burn cold. And yet here she stood at the centre of a marble chamber beneath the streets of London, holding a contract that felt like holding a shard of winter itself, while 12 ancient vampires watched her with silver eyes and absolutely no mercy in their expressions. The bargain was already written. The terms were already sealed in old blood and older magic. All it required was a signature, one mortal signature, pressed in living blood beneath the final clause, and the cursed contract that Orsino Belisar had spent 3 centuries trying to escape would become permanent, irrevocable, and absolute. He would belong to the Obsidian Court forever, his blood, his power, his territory, his very will, all of it surrendered to the 12, who sat in their obsidian thrones and smiled like they had already won, which they had, because the signature was supposed to be his. Cordelia looked across the chamber at Orsino. He stood between 2 court enforcers, twice his height, his white hair dishevelled for the first time in the 2 years she had known him, his pale hands shackled in silver-threaded iron that she could tell was causing him genuine pain from the way the muscle in his jaw kept working. His eyes, the deep, extraordinary shade of midnight blue that had haunted her sleep since approximately the 3rd week she had worked in his household, found hers across the chamber, and what she saw in them was not fear. Orsino Belisar did not know how to be afraid of things that threatened him personally. What she saw was devastation, because he had clearly just realized what she was going to do, and he was already silently ordering her not to do it. She pressed the quill to her own fingertip before he could speak. "Do not," he said, and his voice came out low and cracked, in a way she had genuinely never heard from him before, not in 2 years of working inside the most powerful vampire household in Britain. "Cordelia, do not do this." "Lord Belisar," said the eldest of the 12, Magistrix Seraphine Voss, 800 years old and beautiful like carved bone. "Your mortal appears to be making a choice. Blood law requires we honor it if she signs freely." "She does not understand what she is signing," Orsino said, and now there was something dangerous beneath his voice, something that made the enforcers shift their weight despite themselves. "I understand exactly what I am signing," Cordelia said clearly. She pressed the quill tip to the parchment, drew a thin line of her own blood across the signature line, and wrote her name. The chamber went absolutely silent. Then it erupted. She had not, admittedly, understood the full scope of what would happen next. She had understood the theory that a mortal signature on a cursed bargain of this kind redirected its terms rather than fulfilling them, because the ancient architects of blood law had never anticipated that a human might voluntarily insert herself into a contract written for an immortal. The loophole was real. She had found it herself in the library that Orsino kept beneath his mansion, in a volume so old that the pages crumbled at the edges, and the text was written in a dialect of old Dacian that had taken her 4 hours to painstakingly translate. She had understood that it would void the contract's claim on Orsino entirely. She had perhaps slightly underestimated what it would put in its place. The cold that had lived in the parchment exploded outward through her hand, up her arm, into her chest, and Cordelia made exactly one undignified sound before her knees buckled. She did not hit the marble floor because something moved faster than she could track and caught her, arms around her, an unmistakable presence, the smell of cedar and cold rain that she associated completely and entirely with Orsino. And she registered dimly that he had somehow broken the silver-threaded shackles, because those were definitely not the hands of a man who was still restrained. "What have you done?" he said against her hair, and it did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like grief. "Voided your contract," she managed. "You are welcome. You put yourself in its place. Technically, I redirected its terms. The blood law states that a mortal signature creates a protection clause, not a binding one. I cannot be claimed the way you could be claimed. The contract dissolves. The contract dissolves in 48 hours, he said, and his voice was doing something she had never heard it do, something frayed and raw, while its terms transfer, which means for 48 hours, Cordelia, you belong to the Obsidian Court. She had known that part. She simply had not mentioned it, because she had been reasonably certain that, if she had mentioned it, he would not have let her sign. Magistrix Seraphine rose from her obsidian throne, like smoke taking shape, and her smile was the most terrifying thing in a room that currently contained 12 ancient vampires, 2 enforcers the size of wardrobes, and a cursed contract dissolving in silver flames on the marble floor. "The mortal is correct about the blood law," Seraphine said. "The contract passes to her. Lord Belisar is free of our claim." She tilted her head, and her silver eyes moved to Cordelia with an expression that felt like being appraised by something that had eaten people for 8 centuries and found the exercise entertaining. "However, the mortal is now ours for 48 hours, and we did not agree to be gentle." Orsino stood, and he brought Cordelia with him. And she felt the change in him, the way you feel a storm change the pressure of the air around you. Something massive and ancient and genuinely dangerous pulling itself upright behind the civil exterior he usually wore. "You will not touch her," he said, and every word landed like a stone dropped from a great height. Blood law also states," Orsino said quietly, "that a mortal who signs a cursed bargain under the protection of a sitting lord of the first houses cannot be claimed against that lord's explicit refusal. She is under my protection. She has been under my protection since the day she entered my household, and I am refusing." He looked at Seraphine, and something in his expression made the 800-year-old vampiress take one slow step backward, explicitly. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had fallen when Cordelia signed. This one had edges. Then Seraphine smiled again, and it was a different smile than the predatory one, something older, almost approving, which was somehow worse. 48 hours, Lord Belisar," she said, "after which the contract fully dissolves and neither of you owes us anything, but you must keep her beside you for every moment of it. Blood law requires the protecting lord to maintain continuous proximity to the protected mortal during any active cursed term. If you leave her side, if she leaves yours, the protection clause collapses." She looked at Cordelia again. "Then she belongs to us." They left the chamber. They emerged from the underground entrance that the Obsidian Court maintained beneath a perfectly ordinary-looking wine shop on a perfectly ordinary-looking London street, and the night air hit Cordelia's face like a benediction. She had not realized how cold the marble chamber had been until the comparative warmth of a rainy October evening felt like relief. Orsino's hand had not left her arm. His car, a sleek black thing that his driver Remis had waiting 3 streets over, was waiting for them, and they got in. And then they were moving through London at 2 in the morning, and neither of them spoke for nearly 5 minutes. "How long have you known about the loophole?" he said finally. 3 weeks. Another silence. "You researched this?" "I found the volume by accident initially. The title looked interesting. You have excellent taste in books." She looked out the window at the lights sliding past. Then you came back from that meeting with the Obsidian Court envoy, looking like someone had handed you a death sentence, and I looked more carefully at the volume, and then I researched it very thoroughly for 3 weeks. You taught yourself Old Dacian in 3 weeks. I had a dictionary, and I am very motivated when something matters. He was quiet for a long moment. When she looked at him, his expression was doing something complicated and contained, the way his expressions always were, like there was a great deal happening behind a surface that he had spent centuries learning to make unreadable. You could have told me, he said. You would have found another way. You would have spent weeks looking for an alternative that did not require me to sign anything, because you would not have been able to stand the idea of me taking a risk on your behalf. She paused. Am I wrong? He looked at her, and the unreadable quality of his expression cracked slightly, just at the edges. No, he said. I thought not, Cordelia. Her name in his voice had always done something to her equilibrium that she had worked very hard for 2 years to professionally ignore. Those 48 hours are not going to be comfortable. The court will look for any opportunity to challenge the protection clause. They want leverage over me, and you have just become the most obvious possible lever. I am aware. You will need to stay close to me, continuously. I am aware of that as well. I mean it. Not household close. Not in the same building. Arm's reach, at minimum. The old blood law was extremely literal about physical proximity. She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her. They had been looking at each other this way, carefully, precisely, with a great deal going unsaid, for a long time, and she was tired of things being unsaid. Arm's reach, she said. For 48 hours. Yes, that is going to be an interesting 48 hours. Something moved across his expression that she did not have a name for, and he looked away first, which in 2 years of knowing Orsino Belisar had never happened. His mansion occupied the top 3 floors of a building that looked, from the outside, like a perfectly renovated Victorian townhouse in one of London's quieter, wealthier streets. What it looked like from the inside was a different matter entirely. All dark wood and high ceilings and collections of things that had no business being in a private residence. Objects and books and artifacts that belonged in museums, except that Orsino had acquired most of them before the relevant museums existed, and had absolutely no intention of donating them anywhere. Cordelia had been his head of household staff for 2 years. She had started as a general assistant, hired by the agency that provided human staff to vampire households in the city, and had been promoted within 4 months because she was efficient and organized, and she did not flutter. Most humans who worked in vampire households fluttered, lost their composure at inconvenient moments, became overwhelmed by the reality of what they were actually working in proximity to. Cordelia did not flutter. She learned the rules, she learned the law, she learned the specific preferences and requirements of the household she managed, and she managed it exceptionally. She had also, somewhere in the first year, fallen comprehensively in love with her employer, which was a complication she had handled by being very professional about it at all times. They arrived at the mansion, and Remis, who was himself a vampire of modest age and perfect discretion, took the car without a word. Orsino kept his hand at the small of Cordelia's back as they went inside. Not possessive exactly. More like he was not quite willing to not be touching her. And she said nothing about it because she was still slightly dizzy from the cold that the parchment had driven into her chest, and also because she did not want him to stop. The entrance hall was warm and low-lit, and Vesna, the household's second-in-command, was waiting for them. She was a vampire of perhaps 300 years, young by the standards of the court they had just left, with the white hair and pale complexion common to her kind, and an expression currently radiating controlled alarm. "I heard," she said, looking at Cordelia with something that in a less composed person would have been open distress. "The whole network heard. Are you?" "Functional," Cordelia said, slightly cold. "We need to discuss the next 48 hours. "She stays with me," Orsino said. "Continuously. Blood law, protection clause. Vesna, I need you to contact the first houses and inform them that the Obsidian Court's claim on this household has been voided. Make certain the relevant documents are filed with the council by dawn, of course." Vesna's eyes moved between them with an expression that Cordelia chose not to examine too closely. "The guest chamber near your study." "No," Orsino said. "She will use my rooms. It is the most defensible space in the building, and I will not be separated from her by a corridor." Cordelia looked at him. He met her look with perfect composure, but his jaw was doing that thing again, that controlled tension, and she understood that this was not about propriety or comfort. It was about the fact that he was genuinely frightened, in the particular way that very powerful people were frightened when someone they cared about was in danger, which was mostly expressed as an intense and absolute refusal to allow the danger to continue. "All right," she said. His rooms were on the uppermost floor, vast, high-ceilinged, furnished with the kind of old-world grandeur that did not try to be modern and was more beautiful for it. Deep colors, heavy drapes, books everywhere. A fireplace already lit because someone in the household had anticipated their return. There were 2 distinct sleeping areas separated by a sitting room, which was sensible and appropriate, and Cordelia stood in the sitting room and let herself, for just a moment, simply breathe. The cold was still in her chest, not painful exactly, more like a pressure, like the memory of very cold water. She pressed a hand over her sternum and breathed through it. "Let me see, Orsino," said from behind her. He was very close, arm's reach, because blood law required it, because she had signed a contract on his behalf, because the next 48 hours were going to require a proximity that their professional relationship had carefully never permitted. "It does not hurt," she said. "That is not what I asked." He looked at her hand where it rested over her chest, and there was something in his expression that made the breath catch at the back of her throat. The contract's cold can cause genuine harm to mortal tissue if it was absorbed too quickly. I need to assess it. She lowered her hand. He raised his own cool fingers, always. That was the nature of vampires, and placed them gently over her sternum, with a care that made the professional distance she had maintained for 2 years feel very far away indeed. He was quiet for a moment, eyes half closed, and she could feel something moving through his touch, a faint, searching energy, old and careful. "It is passing," he said. "Your body is processing it. It will be gone within a few hours." He did not remove his hand. "You are not harmed. I told you. You told me many things tonight. That you should perhaps have told me 3 weeks ago," he said quietly. And this time, when she looked up at him, the distance in his expression was entirely gone. She had worked for him for 2 years. She had managed his household and his affairs, and the 100 complex logistics of maintaining a vampire lord's residence in the modern world. She had learned his preferences and his habits and the specific texture of his silences. She had watched him be effortlessly commanding in rooms full of ancient creatures who could have killed her without thinking about it, and she had watched him be unexpectedly careful with small things. The way he replaced books with their spines aligned, the way he always made certain the human staff had adequate heating in their working areas, the way he spoke to her specifically, as though her opinions were not merely tolerated, but genuinely interesting to him. She had been very, very professional about all of it. "I should have told you," she said, "about the loophole. You deserved to know it existed. I should have told you," he said, "that the idea of you being in that chamber at all was—" He stopped. His hand was still against her chest. "I spent the last 3 weeks negotiating with the court because I believed I had no options. If I had known what you were planning, you would have locked me in my rooms. I would have found another way. You just said you believed you had no options." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen from him. Something raw and real and exhausted beneath the centuries of careful composure. "For myself," he said, "I believed I had no options for myself. I would have found something for you. Some way that did not require you to stand in that chamber with 12 ancient predators watching you and sign your name in your own blood." "Orsino," she said, and his name, without the title, landed between them, like something dropped from a height. She had never called him that in 2 years. She saw him register it, saw the slight intake of breath, the shift in his expression. It worked. The contract is dissolving. In 48 hours, this is over. And if something goes wrong in 48 hours, then we deal with it together. She held his gaze. "That has always been my position. You may have missed it because I was being very professional." For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then, carefully, deliberately, he closed the small remaining distance between them and pressed his forehead to hers. Not a kiss. Something older and more sincere than that. A gesture she recognized from the old world codes of conduct he observed out of habit rather than necessity, a gesture of genuine acknowledgement and gratitude between equals. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known," he said very quietly, "in 3 centuries. She closed her eyes briefly. "I know about the loophole," she said. "I know what the next 48 hours require. I also know—" She took a breath. "I also know that I have been very professionally composed about a great many feelings for a very long time, and I am tired of it." His hand, still at her sternum, curled gently. He said, "I am in love with you," she said clearly and without decoration, because she was Cordelia Prescott, and she did not do things by half measures. "I have been for at least a year. I did not say anything because you are my employer, and because the professional complications were significant, and because I was not at all certain you. I did not want to assume." The silence was very brief. "You found a centuries-old loophole in Obsidian Court blood law," he said. "Taught yourself old Dacian in 3 weeks. Walked voluntarily into a chamber of ancient predators and signed away 48 hours of your freedom to protect me. And you were not certain that I—" He stopped. Something in his voice had gone very soft and fierce simultaneously. "Cordelia, yes, I have been very, very carefully not saying things for a long time," he said. "Because you work for me, and because the complications were significant, and because you are mortal and I am not, and that creates a particular kind of—" He exhaled. "I was afraid that what I felt was not something you could want, not something you should have to want, given what I am." She pulled back just enough to look at him properly. "What you are," she said, "is the most honorable person I have ever worked for, who keeps the heating functional for his human staff in January, and replaces books with their spines aligned, and spent 3 weeks trying to find a way out of an impossible situation rather than asking anyone else to share the cost of it. I am not frightened of what you are. I never have been. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her gently, with both hands now framing her face with the utmost care. And it was nothing like the composed and controlled manner he presented to the world. It was honest and a little desperate, and exactly as real as she had spent a year quietly hoping it might be. The night wore on, and the cold in her chest faded, and they sat together in the high-windowed sitting room with the fire going and talked, really talked, in the way that two people talk when they have been carefully not talking for a long time, and suddenly the reason for caution is gone. He told her things about the 3 centuries before she was born, stories not of power and court politics, but of the smaller things, the details, the way the world had changed, and what he had found beautiful and what had broken his heart. She told him about the family she had grown up in, comfortable, ordinary, nothing like a vampire court, and about the agency and why she had chosen to work in vampire households specifically, which was that she had never been afraid of things that other people found frightening, and had always found the supernatural more interesting than threatening. That quality, he said, at some point past 3 in the morning, is either very brave or very dangerous. My mother says dangerous, she agreed. She has been saying it since I was approximately 7. Your mother is not wrong. She is going to have extremely significant opinions about this situation. His mouth curved, not the polished social expression she was familiar with, but a real one, warm and slightly helpless. I imagine so. She likes vampires in principle, Cordelia offered. She reads a great deal of Gothic fiction. That is either reassuring or alarming, somewhere between the two. She settled more comfortably against his shoulder, which she was doing now. This was something that was happening, and she had decided to simply allow it to happen rather than analyzing it into anxiety. Tell me about the Obsidian Court, not the political version, the real version. Why did they come after you specifically? He was quiet for a moment. His arm around her shifted, drew her slightly closer. I have territory that they want, he said. Not just this building, or even this city. I hold the formal covenant of the Thames Corridor, a blood law jurisdiction that covers the supernatural protections of a significant portion of England's southeast. The first houses established those covenants 300 years ago to prevent any single court from monopolizing regional power. The Obsidian Court has been expanding its influence for the last 50 years, acquiring covenants where it can, forcing their surrender where it cannot. He looked at the fire. My covenant cannot be swerved by force, only by the holder's willing signature or by a cursed bargain. They spent a decade building toward this particular trap. 12 signatories on a contract, each carrying a fragment of old blood magic combined in a binding that should have been irresistible. But it required a mortal witness to validate it, Cordelia said, and the witness could sign instead. No one had ever tried that. There has never been a mortal in an Obsidian Court proceeding who was sufficiently— He paused. Sufficiently what? Motivated, he said, and looked at her with an expression that was still something she was getting used to. Orsino Belisar looking at her without any of the careful distance he had maintained for 2 years, and what was underneath it being something vast and sincere, and sufficiently reckless. Motivated and prepared, she corrected. I researched it very thoroughly. I was not reckless. I was strategic. You signed a cursed bargain in your own blood, in a chamber full of ancient vampires. after 3 weeks of research indicating that the outcome would be acceptable. 48 hours belonging to the Obsidian Court is acceptable. 48 hours under your protection, with the contract dissolving at the end of it. And you permanently free of their claim? Yes, that is acceptable. That was always acceptable to me. She looked at him steadily. You were not going to escape that contract without a cost. I chose to be the cost, because the cost to you would have been permanent, and the cost to me has an end date. He was looking at her with an expression she had no name for yet. She was still learning the full vocabulary of his face, now that he was letting her see it. The covenant, he said. You understand that the Thames Corridor covenant still holds, because my signature was never on that contract. It goes nowhere. Yes, I understood that before I signed. And you also understand that once the 48 hours are complete and the contract fully dissolves, the Obsidian Court loses all legal standing to pursue either the covenant or any claim against this household. I understood that as well. You saved 300 years of my work, he said quietly. You saved every human and vampire under the Thames Corridor protection. I saved you, she said. The rest is secondary. He pulled her close and held her for a long time without speaking, and she felt his lips against her hair, and outside the high windows London went on, being London in the small hours of the morning, indifferent and bright and completely unaware. The first challenge came at dawn, which was itself a problem because dawn meant the enforced limitation of Orsino's freedom of movement. Eyes and direct sunlight being a combination that ranged from uncomfortable to fatal, depending on the individual's age and strength. Orsino could tolerate filtered light through heavy glass, but direct exposure was genuinely dangerous, which meant that the daylight hours were spent inside the mansion with the heavy curtains drawn and every room sealed against direct solar ingress. The challenge did not come in the form of Cordelia expected, not another contingent from the Obsidian Court, not another contract, not a direct confrontation. It came in the form of a man named Aldrich Voss, who arrived at the mansion door at 7 in the morning and presented himself as Magistrix Seraphine's personal emissary, and who was mortal. That last fact was important, because a mortal emissary meant the blood law protections that applied to vampire-on-vampire conflict did not apply. A mortal agent could move through the world differently, interact with the household staff differently, and create complications that the ancient codes had not anticipated because, in the old world, vampires had not often sent mortal agents. Vesna dealt with him at the door. Cordelia, arm's reach from Orsino in the library, where they had retreated with coffee and the morning's necessary logistics, watched through the household security feed on Orsino's tablet and felt the situation's shape clarifying. He is here to assess whether the protection clause is intact, Orsino said, looking at the same feed. If he can establish, through any legal or technical means, that there has been a break in continuous proximity, the clause collapses. There has not been a break. No. But if he can create one, his eyes moved from the tablet to her. If he can lure you to the door while I cannot follow due to sunlight restrictions, if he can engineer a situation that requires you to move beyond arm's reach. He cannot, she said, because I am not going anywhere near that door. He looked at her with that same expression, the one she was naming, slowly as the look of someone who had learned the hard way not to rely on anyone and was in the process of relearning. Tell Vesna to inform him that the clause is intact, and he is welcome to file a formal verification request with the council, she said, which will take 3 days to process. by which point the contract will have dissolved. He may not accept that. He does not have to accept it. He has to comply with it. Blood law procedure gives him no other option. She held Orsino's gaze. I researched this very thoroughly. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, real and warm and entirely for her. Vesna delivered the message. Aldrich Voss stood on the doorstep for 11 minutes in what was clearly calculated intimidation, and then left. The morning moved forward. The second challenge was internal, which was both more and less expected. At midday, Cordelia was going over the household accounts, not because they required urgent attention, but because keeping her hands occupied with familiar work was her preferred method of managing stress. When there was a knock at the library door, and it opened to admit a vampire she had not previously encountered. He was young by vampire standards, perhaps a century, perhaps less, with white hair braided back and an expression that was trying to be deferential and not quite succeeding. His name, she would discover, was Casimir, and he was one of 3 vampires in the mansion who had been placed there by the First House's Council as observers, tasked with monitoring the household's compliance with the terms under which the Thames Corridor Covenant operated. She had known they existed. She had not fully mapped which members of the household they were. Casimir looked at her with an expression she did not like, calculating in a specific way, the way of someone who has been given information and is deciding how to use it, and then at Orsino, who had looked up from the documents he was working through with the particular quality of attention he gave to situations he found potentially threatening. "My apologies for the interruption, Lord Belisar," Casimir said. "I need to speak with the mortal, privately." "No," said Orsino. "Blood law procedure permits the observer to interview the protected mortal in private to verify that the protection is willing and not coerced." This was, in fact, true. Cordelia knew it was true because she had read the relevant blood law section 3 weeks ago. She looked at Orsino. "He is correct," she said quietly. "The procedure is legitimate. The interview is meant to confirm." I signed freely. "The interview is an opportunity to pressure you without my presence," Orsino said, his voice very even. "Yes," she agreed. "And I am going to be fine." She looked at him steadily. "Trust me." The struggle on his face was brief and genuine. Then he said, "If he speaks to you in a manner I find unacceptable, there will be consequences." "Noted," Casimir said, with somewhat less confidence than he had walked in with. The interview lasted 17 minutes. Casimir was not brutal. He was systematic, asking targeted questions, designed to reveal coercion or confusion or any suggestion that Cordelia had not understood what she was signing. He framed questions in ways meant to imply that perhaps she had been manipulated, that perhaps she had signed under duress, that perhaps the protection clause was not as clean as it appeared. She answered every question precisely, accurately, and without faltering, because she had anticipated every angle he could use, and she was better prepared than he was. When he tried to suggest that her feelings for the lord of the household might constitute a form of undue influence, she looked at him with the expression that her co-workers at her previous jobs had called the Cordelia look and said, calmly, that feelings were not coercion, that she was a competent adult who had made an informed decision after 3 weeks of independent research, and that if the council wished to challenge the validity of her signature, they were welcome to bring the matter before the full blood law tribunal, which would cost them considerably more time than the 31 hours remaining on the contract's dissolution timeline. He left 17 minutes after he arrived. Orsino met her outside the library door, technically just within arm's reach, which she suspected had not been accidental, and his expression when he saw her face was something she thought she would spend a long time carrying with her. "You are remarkable," he said. "I told you I would be fine. That is not the same as not being worried." She stepped close and took his hand deliberately. His fingers closed around hers with something that felt like relief. The afternoon brought no new challenges, only the texture of two people renegotiating the shape of the space between them. All the habits and distances of 2 years, shifting and reforming around the new reality of things said. Cordelia worked. Orsino worked. They did so in the same room, closer than professional distance had ever permitted, with the occasional exchange that was sometimes about the household and sometimes about nothing professionally relevant at all. She learned that he disliked tea, which she had not known, because she had never been in a position to observe him eat or drink anything before. She learned that he had opinions about the precise temperature at which coffee should be served that were very strong and very specific. She told him that she had a cat living with her sister because she traveled too much for her work to keep a pet at home, and that the cat was named Marchioness. And he looked at her for a moment with such undisguised delight at this information that she laughed out loud, which made him look even more delighted, which was an expression she was rapidly deciding she wanted to be responsible for as often as possible. At 4 in the afternoon, Vesna brought a message from the Obsidian Court. Not Aldrich Voss this time. The message was formal, heavy paper, sealed with the court's obsidian wax, delivered by courier. Vesna placed it on the table between Orsino and Cordelia and stood back with an expression of controlled concern. Orsino opened it. His face went very still. Cordelia read it over his shoulder, because they were close enough for that now. And what it said was brief and precise. The Obsidian Court was filing an emergency petition with the Blood Law Council claiming procedural irregularity in the original contract proceeding. Specifically, that the mortal signature had been obtained under condition of emotional duress, given the established personal connection between the mortal and the protected vampire, and that under this theory the protection clause was invalid, and the original contract terms against Lord Belisar, Sutter, should be reinstated. The filing was scheduled for review at a council session at midnight, to 23 hours before the contract would have dissolved on its own. "They cannot," Cordelia said. "They can file the petition. Whether it succeeds is another matter." Orsino set the letter down. His expression was very controlled, and she knew him well enough now to know what that control was containing. But if the petition is accepted for review, the dissolution timeline is paused pending adjudication, which could take weeks during which I remain under the contract's terms. Yes, she thought for a moment. The shape of the problem was clear. The Obsidian Court's argument had a surface plausibility. Personal connection could theoretically be argued as influence, even without coercion, particularly given the centuries-old conservatism of blood law interpretation. If they got their petition before a sympathetic council panel, the dissolution could be suspended indefinitely. "We need to be at that council session," she said. "You are not going to a council session at midnight, Orsino." She turned to look at him directly. "I am the signatory. I have standing to appear and contest the petition. You can argue the law all night, but the most powerful argument against emotional duress is me standing in front of them and demonstrating that I made this decision independently, competently, and fully informed. She held his gaze. Also, if I do not contest it and the petition succeeds, I spend weeks under Obsidian Court terms, which seems worse than one midnight council session. He looked at her for a long moment. The Blood Law Council chambers are in the Nocturne Court, beneath the Thames, he said. A gathering of the full council at midnight will include every significant vampire power in the city. I am aware it will not be like the Obsidian Court chamber. There will be no single tribunal. It will be the full council, 43 members, most of whom are old enough that mortal lives register to them as something between brief and negligible. I know, Cordelia, I am not fragile, she said, and I am not passive. I walked into the Obsidian Court chamber voluntarily. I can walk into a council session voluntarily, and I will be far better prepared this time because I have had the afternoon. She reached across the table and touched his hand. But I need you with me, not because I cannot manage it, because you are the Lord of Record, and your presence alongside mine tells the council something that my standing there alone does not. He turned his hand over under hers and held it. Together, he said. Together. Vesna was summoned, practical preparations were made, and Cordelia spent the remaining hours before midnight reading everything she could access about the emotional duress clause in blood law, which was fortunately something that Orsino's library contained substantial material on. Because Orsino collected legal texts the way some people collected art and found the historical development of supernatural jurisprudence apparently fascinating, which was one of several thousand things she was still discovering about him, and found herself delighted by at every turn. At 11 they went downstairs, and Remis had the car waiting. The Nocturne Court beneath the Thames was everything the Obsidian Court chamber had been, and more, larger, older, the kind of ancient that you felt in your bones, rather than simply understood intellectually. The architecture was genuinely medieval, preserved in perfect condition beneath centuries of river and city weight lit by the blue-white light that vampire-built spaces used in place of anything solar. The air smelled of old stone and formal ceremony, and the particular electricity of power gathered in one place. 43 council members, seated in a semicircle of tiered stone. Magistrix Seraphine Voss on the petitioner's side, with Aldrich Voss and 2 other Obsidian Court representatives at her flank, looking like she had been expecting this and planned for it, and was certain of her outcome. Cordelia walked in beside Orsino, his hand at the small of her back, and did not look at Seraphine. She looked at the council. The presiding member was an ancient named Lord Castor, 7 centuries old, white-haired and silver-eyed like all his kind, with a face that had forgotten how to show expression the way stone forgets what it was before it became stone. He looked at Cordelia for a long moment when she and Orsino took their place at the respondent's position. "The council notes the unusual nature of tonight's petition," he said. His voice was very dry and very old. "We will hear the petitioner," Seraphine argued beautifully. Cordelia gave her that. The magistrix was eloquent, precise, and absolutely committed to her position. The argument she made was sophisticated. Not that Cordelia had been forced, but that a mortal employed in a vampire's household, who had been working in close proximity to that vampire for 2 years and had developed personal feelings for them, was by structural definition in a position of unequal influence, and that the ancient architects of blood law had never intended for the protection clause to be activated by someone in such a position, because the purity of the willing act was, in their view, compromised. It was a strong argument. Cordelia had spent 4 hours preparing for it. When Lord Castor looked at her and said, "The respondent has standing to address the council," she stepped forward. She spoke for 22 minutes. She walked the council through the 3 weeks of research with specific citations. She addressed the old Dacian text, its translation, and the interpretive history of the protection clause going back to its original drafting. She addressed the duress question directly and precisely. Structural inequality of employment was not equivalent to coercion. Emotions were not equivalent to undue influence. And if the council accepted the Obsidian Court's interpretation, then they were establishing a precedent that no mortal employee could ever make a legally clean decision that involved the interests of their vampire employer, which would effectively void hundreds of existing agreements across the British supernatural jurisdiction and create chaos in the carefully maintained blood law framework that the council itself was supposed to protect. She addressed the question of her competence with 3 examples, 2 precedents, and 1 direct quotation from the council's own charter regarding mortal signatories. And then she said quietly that she was standing in front of 43 ancient creatures who could have dismissed her existence entirely, and she was doing so without being afraid, and she thought that said something about the quality of her free will and her decision-making that was worth their consideration. The council chamber was very quiet when she finished. Lord Castor looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Magistrix Seraphine. "The petition is denied," he said. "The protection clause is valid. The contract continues its dissolution timeline. This matter is closed." Seraphine's composure was impeccable, which was the most dangerous sign. Cordelia knew enough about political creatures by now to know that impeccable composure in defeat meant future planning. But there was nothing to be done about future planning tonight, and the council was already rising, and Orsino's hand was at her back again, warm and steadying. They walked out of the nocturne court and back through the ancient corridors, and when they reached the surface and the night air again, Orsino stopped walking. She turned to face him. He was looking at her with an expression she had no category for, something between awe and devastation and tenderness, all of it raw and real, and he reached out and touched her face with one careful hand. 22 minutes, he said. Thorough. You were extraordinary. His thumb traced gently along her cheekbone. You walked into that chamber, and you took 43 of the most powerful creatures in this city apart, with the precision of a surgeon and the composure of someone who had been doing it their entire life. I have been managing complicated rooms full of difficult people for 2 years, she said. You have a very demanding household. His laugh was soft and genuine, and it went through her like light. Come home, he said. They went home. The next 23 hours were quieter than any of the preceding ones. No challenges came, no emissaries, no petitions. The Obsidian Court, apparently, had expended its options and recognized the situation clearly enough to stand down, at least until they had time to develop a new approach, which was a problem for a future that was not tonight. Cordelia slept for 6 hours in Orsino's guest room, deeply and without disturbance, which she considered a significant achievement given the events of the preceding 36 hours. When she woke, late morning, the household was quiet, and the light through the heavy curtains was the diffuse gold of an October day that could not quite decide if it wanted to be sunny. Orsino was in the library, where she found him surrounded by documents. The formal dissolution paperwork for the contract, she realized, organized with the methodical thoroughness she associated with him and had always found quietly appealing. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face at the sight of her. Just her. Walking through his library door with her hair not yet done and one of the guest room's borrowed cardigans over her shoulders was something she thought she might carry for a very long time. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." She looked at the documents. "How much is left to file?" "Vesna is handling most of it. The formal dissolution notification goes to the council at midnight. After that, the contract is legally extinct." He looked at her steadily. "It is over." "Almost," she said. "Midnight?" "Midnight," he agreed. They spent the day together in a way that felt, Cordelia thought, like something genuinely new, not employer and employee, not lord and household staff, but two people discovering the ordinary sheep of each other in the particular light of beginning. He showed her sections of the library she had never had reason to access before, collections of things he had gathered over 3 centuries that mapped the private contours of his interests rather than the formal ones. There were natural history collections, pressed specimens and geological samples, and astronomical charts predating most modern observatories. There was an enormous section of music, not recordings but scores, hand-copied manuscripts of compositions that had never been formally published, because the composers had been his friends and had simply given them to him across the years. He played her one of them on the grand piano in the long room on the 2nd floor, which she had always known existed and had never heard opened before, and it was heart-breaking and beautiful. And she sat beside him on the bench with her shoulder against his arm, and let herself simply be there, while he played something that was 300 years old and had never been heard by anyone except the people the composer had trusted. She told him about her degree in archival studies, how she had always been drawn to old things, to the careful work of preserving what might otherwise be lost, and how this had perhaps been the universe's method of pointing her toward work in vampire households, where old things were more abundant than anywhere else. He said that he thought the universe had been very sensible. She said she thought so too. At 8 in the evening, Vesna brought them dinner, Cordelia's dinner, since Orsino's requirements were different and handled separately by other means. And they ate together in the library in the particular comfortable companionship of two people who have recently discovered that they have been quietly constructing a home in each other and have now simply stopped pretending otherwise. "There are things we need to discuss," he said at some point during the evening, "about what happens after midnight. Not immediately. I am not suggesting that decisions need to be made tonight, but there are considerations. That you are immortal and I am not," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Yes. And that my employment situation is now significantly complicated." A ghost of a smile. "Also, yes, and that the Obsidian Court, while currently without legal standing, is not going to simply stop wanting the Thames Corridor Covenant. That is the most immediately pressing consideration," he agreed, "which will require ongoing vigilance and more sophisticated defenses than the one we improvised this week." "I want to help with that," she said, immediately. "Not just in a household management capacity. I've found the loophole in 3 weeks working from your library with a dictionary. Imagine what I could do with direct access and the specific problem defined in advance." He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one she was increasingly recognizing, as what Orsino Belisar looked like when something moved him genuinely and he was allowing himself to show it. "You want to be involved in the legal and political work," he said. "I am extremely good at research, and I have apparently demonstrated a competency for blood law procedure in council settings." She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, I want to be involved." "Your salary is going to require renegotiation," he said, "substantially. And your formal role in the household, also substantially. And the question of whether you continue to live separately from the household, which seems increasingly inefficient given—" "Orsino," she said, "are you asking me to move in?" He considered this. "I am suggesting," he said, "that from a purely logistical perspective, given your expanded role and the ongoing security considerations, it would be sensible for you to maintain a permanent residence within the mansion." "From a purely logistical perspective," she said, and she could not keep the smile out of her voice. "Purely logistical," he agreed, and the warmth gave the entire thing away. "I will need to collect Marchioness," she said, "from your sister. She will need a thorough introduction to the household. She is very confident. She will probably immediately take over your best chair." "I have many chairs," he said. "I think we can accommodate her." At 11:50, they were standing in the library together. Orsino with the dissolution paperwork ready to send the moment midnight registered on the council's official clock, and Cordelia beside him, aware of her own heartbeat, aware of the coldness that had faded entirely from her chest over the last day, aware of the extraordinary and unlikely shape of the last 48 hours. 10 seconds, Vesna said from the doorway. Monitoring the council clock on her phone, Cordelia looked at Orsino. He was looking at her. "Thank you," he said, very quietly, and it contained everything. 3 weeks of her research, and the chamber, and the cold parchment, and the council session, and the piano, and all the small, careful things she had found in his library, and the 2 years of professional distance, and the love that had been building quietly underneath all of it, patient and real, and finally allowed to be what it was. "Thank you," she said back, and it contained everything too. "Midnight," Vesna said. Orsino sent the documents. "Somewhere beneath the Thames, in the ancient chambers of the Blood Law Council, a contract that had threatened to imprison one of the oldest and most powerful vampires in England became, officially and irrevocably, extinct. The cold was gone, the threat was gone. The 50-year campaign of the Obsidian Court against Orsino Belisar's covenant hit a wall from which it would not recover, because the failed petition, the denied challenge, and the legal record of Cordelia Prescott's council appearance would stand in the blood law archives as precedent. And Magistrix Seraphine was old enough and intelligent enough to understand what fighting precedent would cost compared to what the Thames Corridor Covenant was worth. She did not come again. None of them did. 3 months after the contract dissolved, Cordelia moved into the mansion. She brought Marchioness, who did immediately take over the best chair in the library and survey the household, with the expression of a cat who had found the situation acceptable and would be consenting to remain. Orsino looked at the cat in his chair for a long moment, and then sat down in the adjacent chair with perfect equanimity, which Cordelia considered the most definitive possible evidence that he was genuinely happy. Her role in the household reorganized around both its administrative needs and the more specialized work of legal research and political intelligence for the vampire community the Covenant protected. She was good at it, better than good. The combination of her archival training and the ancient library and Orsino's centuries of political knowledge created something that neither of them could have built alone, a working partnership that was as intellectually satisfying as it was effective, the other vampire households in the city noticed. Some were cautious about the arrangement. A mortal with real influence inside one of the first house estates was not something the old world codes had accounted for, and old world codes resisted accounting for things. But Orsino's standing in the community was significant, and his quiet confidence in Cordelia's judgment carried weight that the skeptics found difficult to argue with. And gradually the caution in other quarters softened into something closer to grudging respect. Vesna remained entirely loyal and efficient and developed over the following months, an expression she deployed whenever she observed Orsino and Cordelia in the same room that contained absolutely no surprise whatsoever and a great deal of quiet satisfaction. Remis remained silent and perfectly reliable. Casimir, who had conducted the duress interview and left with somewhat less confidence than he had arrived with, requested a transfer to a different household 3 weeks after the contract's dissolution. Cordelia thought this was sensible of him. The question of mortality, of the gap between her finite lifespan and his infinite one, did not disappear. It was not the kind of question that disappeared, but they talked about it over months of long evenings and honest conversation, with the same precision and care that Cordelia applied to blood law research and Orsino applied to the things he had kept careful watch over for 3 centuries. There were options in the vampire world for the right circumstances, not transformations to be demanded or imposed, but choices to be considered carefully over time, between people who had built something real enough to withstand the weight of that consideration. They did not rush it. Neither of them was the kind of person who rushed toward the significant things. What they had was real and present, and every day that passed added to it, and they trusted that the future would be navigated with the same honesty that had gotten them this far, which was, to say the honest, recognition that when you found the person who made you want to be brave in new ways, the right response was not to manage it from a professional distance, but to step forward. Cordelia had signed her name to a cursed parchment in a room full of ancient predators because she loved him, and because she was good at research, and because she had looked at the cost and found it acceptable. And the world had reorganized itself around that choice in ways she was still discovering. Month by month, in the library, and the long room, and the quiet mornings, and the complicated midnights, and the particular warmth of the life they were building together, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Orsino was at the piano one evening in February, playing something that was not 300 years old but new. Something he was composing, she realized, by the way he kept stopping and adjusting, the particular focused attention of creating rather than remembering. And she was at the library table with a volume on blood law jurisdictional boundaries, and Marchioness was in the best chair, and the fire was going, and London was outside being London. And she thought, this is what it looks like when something that seemed impossible becomes, simply, real. She looked up from her book and caught him watching her from the piano bench, his white hair loose around his face, his midnight blue eyes warm in the firelight, all 3 centuries of him contained in the particular way he was looking at her, as though she were the most significant thing that had happened in all of them. She smiled at him, he smiled back, and then turned to the piano and kept composing, and she went back to her book, and Marchioness adjusted slightly in the chair without waking, and the fire went on burning, and outside the Thames ran on carrying its ancient covenant through the modern city protected and intact. And inside the mansion on the quiet street, two people who had found each other in the space between the old world and the new, kept building something that was theirs. It was not a perfectly simple life. The vampire world was old and complicated, and the politics of ancient courts did not stop simply because one contract had dissolved and one petition had failed. There were other challenges, other negotiations, other moments that required the careful combination of Orsino's centuries of knowledge and Cordelia's fierce, precise intelligence, and they met each of them together, as they had agreed to do in a car driving through London at 2 a.m. when the ink on a cursed bargain was barely dry. But it was a real life, rich and complex and full of things she had never expected. The extraordinary range of what 3 centuries of living had meant to him, and the way she was learning it piece by piece, the ways in which she surprised him constantly, still with the quality of her thinking and the directness of her heart, the ongoing negotiation of two people who were very different from each other in ways that mattered, and very similar to each other in the ways that mattered more. Love, she had found, was not a single signed document. It was a continuous practice. It required the same qualities that blood law research required: patience, precision, the willingness to sit with complicated material until you understood it well enough to trust it. And it required the kind of bravery that was not the dramatic kind, not the kind she had demonstrated in a chamber of ancient vampires or a council session at midnight, but the smaller and more continuous kind. The bravery of saying true things, of choosing closeness over the safety of distance, of staying present to the life you were actually living rather than the safer, lesser version you might have settled for. She had signed her name on a cursed bargain to protect him, and what she had found on the other side of it was not merely his freedom. It was her own, from the careful, managed smallness of keeping her feelings behind a professional partition, from the loneliness of loving someone and choosing not to tell them, from the diminished version of herself that would have continued indefinitely if she had not, eventually, sat in an ancient chamber and pressed a quill to her own finger and made a different choice. The night she had signed, she had been afraid, not of the vampires, not of the contract, not of the 48 hours of being under the court's nominal claim. She had been afraid of what it would mean if she survived the next 48 hours and went back to being his head of household staff and being very professional about everything. She was not afraid of that anymore on a Thursday evening in early March, when the city outside was doing its tentative best toward spring and the library was warm, and Marchioness had discovered that Orsino's shoulder was a viable sleeping surface. Cordelia looked up from the document she was annotating and said, conversationally, "I have been thinking about the question of transformation." He looked up from his own work. His expression was careful and very present. "I have not reached a conclusion," she said. "I want to be clear about that. It is not a decision to be made from romance or from fear of loss or from anything except the most honest possible assessment of what I want for my own life." She met his gaze. "But I have been thinking about it seriously, and I wanted you to know." "All right," he said, and in those 2 words was everything she needed. No pressure, no relief, no agenda, just the same patient attention he brought to all the significant things. "I will probably want to talk about it a great deal before I decide anything," she said. "I expect nothing less, and I will want access to historical accounts from people who have gone through it. Primary sources. I have several volumes. Also 2 acquaintances who made the choice and would speak candidly. "Of course you do." She looked at him with great warmth. "You have everything." "Not always," he said. "I did not always have you." She held his gaze across the library, across the books and the firelight and the sleeping cat and all the careful, accumulated detail of the life they had made, and the truth of it moved through her the way important true things do, simply, without drama, with the absolute weight of something that is simply true. "You have me," she said. "I know," he said. "I am aware of it every day." Marchioness shifted on his shoulder, opened one eye in mild territorial assessment of the emotional temperature of the room, found it acceptable, and went back to sleep. And in the old mansion on the quiet London street, where the Thames corridor covenant held, and the ancient books were perfectly alphabetized, and the heating was reliably functional in January, two people who had found each other in the space between a cursed bargain and a mortal signature went on quietly and completely, being in love.